Have you ever noticed how anxiety changes the way you see the world? The street you walked yesterday suddenly feels unsafe. A delayed message becomes a sign that something is wrong. A harmless conversation turns into evidence that you've made a terrible mistake. The danger hasn't changed, but your mind has. We often imagine anxiety as a response to life. What if it's something far more subtle? What if anxiety is a way of seeing life itself? For centuries, we've believed that Little Red Riding Hood is a story about a girl who encounters a dangerous wolf deep in the forest. But what if that isn't the real story? What if the wolf is only the final image of something that began much earlier? Carl Jung believed that fairy tales preserve the deepest patterns of the human psyche. Marie-Louise von Franz showed that their characters are not merely people, but living forces within us. If that is true, then the forest is more than a place, and the wolf is more than a predator. Perhaps the greatest danger was never the wolf waiting among the trees. Perhaps it was the moment Little Red Riding Hood stopped trusting her own inner compass. And perhaps that same moment is still unfolding in millions of lives today. There is a strange kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from running, working, or staying awake too late. It comes from constantly preparing for disasters that never arrive. You wake up already scanning the day for what might go wrong. A simple conversation replays endlessly in your mind. An unanswered text feels heavier than it should. A small uncertainty grows into 100 imagined outcomes. Before anything has actually happened, your body is already living through the consequences of a future that exists only in your imagination. This is the hidden rhythm of anxiety. It rarely announces itself with dramatic moments. Instead, it quietly reshapes the way you experience reality. The world doesn't become more dangerous. It simply begins to feel that way. Psychologists often describe anxiety as hypervigilance, a state in which the mind is constantly searching for potential threats. It is an ancient survival mechanism that once protected our ancestors from real predators. But in the modern world, that same mechanism can become trapped in an endless loop, reacting not only to danger itself, but to the possibility of danger. The mind starts filling empty spaces with frightening stories. A silence becomes rejection. A delay becomes catastrophe. A shadow becomes evidence that something terrible is about to happen. Over time, life begins to resemble a forest where every unfamiliar sound demands immediate attention. Every unexpected movement feels like a warning. Every path seems capable of leading toward disaster. And perhaps that image is not accidental. Long before psychologists gave names to anxiety disorders, ancient storytellers understood something profound about the human mind. They knew that there are moments in life when every person must leave the safety of the familiar and enter a symbolic forest, a place where certainty disappears and instinct becomes the only reliable guide. This is why fairy tales have survived for centuries. They were never meant only for children. They preserve emotional truths that remain unchanged even when the world around us changes completely. Among all these stories, few capture the experience of anxious consciousness more vividly than Little Red Riding Hood. Most of us remember it as a warning about strangers or disobedience. But beneath that familiar narrative lies another story, one that speaks directly to anyone who has ever lived under the weight of constant anticipation. Because before Little Red Riding Hood ever meets the wolf, something far more important has already happened. She has entered the forest, and perhaps every anxious mind has entered that same forest long before it realizes it is lost. Every meaningful journey begins with a path, not because the path guarantees safety, but because it gives direction. It allows us to move forward without knowing exactly what lies ahead. In many ways, that simple act of taking the next step is the first expression of trust. Little Red Riding Hood begins her story in precisely that moment. She leaves home carrying a small basket for her grandmother, following a familiar trail through the forest. At first glance, Nothing about this seems extraordinary. It feels almost ordinary, a child completing a simple task. But fairy tales rarely concern themselves with ordinary events. Carl Jung believed that the landscapes of fairy tales are not geographical places but psychological ones. The forest is not simply a collection of trees. It is the vast territory of the unconscious, the part of ourselves that cannot be controlled, predicted, or fully understood. Entering the forest means stepping beyond the comforting boundaries of certainty and into the unpredictable landscape where genuine psychological growth begins. Every human life contains such moments. A new relationship, the loss of someone we love, a career change, a diagnosis, an unexpected failure. These experiences feel like walking into unfamiliar woods. The old maps no longer work, and the future becomes impossible to see clearly. Under healthy circumstances, uncertainty awakens curiosity. We become attentive without becoming consumed. Our instincts help us distinguish between what deserves caution and what deserves exploration. Anxiety changes that balance. It quietly erodes the confidence that allows us to keep walking. Instead of trusting our ability to respond when challenges appear, we begin believing that every possible danger must be anticipated in advance. The mind no longer follows the path. It wanders far ahead, imagining every hidden threat before a single one has appeared. This is how hypervigilance is born. The future becomes more vivid than the present. The imagined danger becomes more convincing than reality itself. Gradually, the path disappears beneath endless questions. What if something goes wrong? What if I miss an important sign? What if I'm not prepared? The journey has not changed. Only the traveler has. Marie-Louise von Franz often observed that fairy tales describe the development of consciousness through symbolic encounters rather than abstract ideas. Before any monster appears, something inside the hero has already begun to change. The real drama starts long before the visible conflict. The same is true of anxiety. Long before life confronts us with genuine danger, our relationship with uncertainty has already been transformed. And it is precisely in that fragile moment, when trust begins to give way to anticipation, that another presence quietly enters the story. The wolf has been watching the path all along. When Little Red Riding Hood finally meets the wolf, something unexpected happens. He does not attack. He does not chase her through the forest. He doesn't even reveal himself as a monster. Instead, he speaks. For generations, this moment has been interpreted as a warning about strangers and deception. But psychologically, the conversation itself is far more important than the predator standing before her. The wolf's greatest weapon is not his teeth. It is his ability to redirect her attention. With a few simple questions, he invites her to look away from the path, to notice the flowers, to slow down, to wander. At first, his words seem harmless, even inviting. Nothing appears dangerous yet. That is precisely what makes the encounter so profound. Carl Jung observed that the shadow rarely enters consciousness as something immediately recognizable. It often appears disguised, sometimes attractive, sometimes persuasive, sometimes strangely familiar. The shadow is not merely evil. It is everything the conscious personality has neglected, feared, or refused to understand about itself. The wolf embodies this unsettling ambiguity. He is undeniably dangerous, yet he is also intelligent, patient, observant. He understands the forest better than the girl walking through it. Symbolically, he represents a force that already belongs to the landscape she has entered. Marie-Louise von Franz frequently reminded us that fairy tale figures are autonomous psychic realities. They cannot simply be dismissed or destroyed because they represent energies that exist within every human being. The wolf is one of those realities. He is instinct in its untamed form, capable of destruction, but also impossible to erase from the human psyche. This is where anxiety quietly distorts the story. When we are overwhelmed by fear, we begin treating every instinct as if it were the wolf. Every unfamiliar feeling becomes suspicious. Every strong emotion seems dangerous. Instead of learning to distinguish healthy intuition from impulsive reaction, we silence them both. The result is an inner world where every voice sounds equally threatening. Ironically, this leaves us less protected, not more. Real intuition is calm. It notices without panicking. It recognizes danger without becoming consumed by it. Anxiety, however, imitates intuition while speaking with a very different voice. It demands urgency. It insists on certainty. It whispers that disaster is always just one step away. The tragedy of Little Red Riding Hood is not that she encounters the wolf. Every meaningful life eventually does. The tragedy is that she has not yet learned how to recognize the difference between a guide, a temptation, and a genuine threat. And once that distinction begins to disappear, the forest itself is transformed. Soon, every sound will seem capable of hiding a wolf. There is a moment when anxiety stops reacting to danger and begins creating its own. At first, the change is almost impossible to notice. You double-check that the door is locked. You reread an email before sending it. You replay a conversation, wondering if you said the wrong thing. These seem like ordinary habits, even responsible ones. But little by little, something shifts. The mind no longer searches for what is true. It searches for what could go wrong. Every possibility becomes a warning. Every uncertainty becomes evidence. Every silence demands an explanation. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a state in which the nervous system remains on alert long after immediate danger has passed. From an evolutionary perspective, it once served an essential purpose. A human being who noticed subtle signs of danger was more likely to survive. But the modern mind faces a different challenge. Most of the threats we anticipate never arrive, yet the body responds as if they already have. A racing heart, restless sleep, tight muscles, constant fatigue. The body cannot distinguish between an imagined catastrophe repeated 100 times and a real one experienced once. Carl Jung understood that what we repeatedly imagine begins to shape the landscape of the psyche. The images we feed become the reality through which consciousness interprets the world. Fear, when left unquestioned, does not simply warn us about danger. It teaches us to expect it everywhere. This is why anxiety can become so convincing. It borrows the language of protection, while quietly replacing our ability to perceive clearly. Imagine walking through a forest where every branch cracking beneath the wind sounds like footsteps. Every shadow resembles a predator. Every movement in the distance demands immediate attention. Eventually, you stop seeing the forest. You see only possible attacks. That is exactly what anxiety does to consciousness. It narrows the world until survival becomes the only objective. Marie-Louise von Franz often observed that fairy tales reveal what happens when one psychic force grows so dominant that it overwhelms all the others. Anxiety functions in much the same way. Fear begins as one voice among many, but gradually it becomes the loudest voice in the mind, drowning out curiosity, imagination, joy, and even intuition. And this may be the greatest paradox of all. The person who tries hardest to avoid danger often becomes unable to recognize genuine safety. Because once every sound resembles a wolf, peace itself begins to feel suspicious. Which leads us to the question hidden at the heart of this entire story. If anxiety can imitate the voice of intuition so perfectly, how can we ever learn to tell them apart? What if the wolf was never the greatest danger in the story? At first, that question seems almost absurd. After all, the wolf deceives, devours, and destroys. He is undeniably dangerous. But every fairy tale asks us to look beyond what is obvious. The wolf appears only once. Fear, however, can remain for a lifetime. This is the distinction that changes everything. The deepest psychological wound is not created by encountering danger. It is created when the expectation of danger becomes the lens through which we experience reality. Once that happens, the forest no longer needs a wolf. Our imagination supplies one. Carl Jung wrote that consciousness is shaped not only by external events, but also by the symbolic images through which we interpret them. Those images are never passive. They organize perception itself. If the dominant image within the psyche is one of constant threat, then even an ordinary world begins to appear hostile. The danger is no longer outside us. It becomes the architecture of our perception. Marie-Louise von Franz often emphasized that fairy tales do not simply describe external adventures. They reveal inner transformations. The decisive moment is rarely the battle itself. It is the shift that takes place within consciousness before the battle has even begun. Perhaps that is what has happened to so many of us. We do not merely fear failure, we expect it. We do not merely prepare for rejection, we anticipate it before anyone has spoken. We do not simply recognize risk. We begin to organize our entire lives around avoiding imagined catastrophes. Little by little, caution becomes control. Control becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes isolation. And eventually, we mistake emotional imprisonment for safety. The tragedy is not that fear exists. Fear has always been one of humanity's greatest protectors. The tragedy begins when fear takes the place of intuition. Intuition is remarkably different. It does not shout. It does not rush. It does not demand absolute certainty. It observes quietly. It recognizes patterns. It responds to reality instead of inventing it. Fear says, something terrible could happen. Intuition asks, what is actually here? That single difference can transform an entire life. Perhaps the true lesson of Little Red Riding Hood is not that we must spend our lives searching for wolves. Perhaps it is that we must learn to hear the quiet voice that existed long before fear learned how to imitate it. And once we recover that voice, the forest does not become less mysterious. It simply becomes a place where we can walk again. Every fairy tale ends with a return. Not a return to the place where the journey began, but to the world as it now appears through transformed eyes. The forest has not disappeared. The path has not become easier. The possibility of encountering a wolf still exists. What has changed is the traveler. This is perhaps the most overlooked lesson hidden within Little Red Riding Hood. The story does not promise a life free from danger. It never suggests that wisdom can erase uncertainty or that maturity can eliminate fear. Instead, it points towards something far more realistic and far more hopeful. It suggests that we can learn to walk without allowing fear to become our guide. Carl Jung believed that individuation is not the process of becoming fearless. It is the lifelong work of becoming whole. That wholeness emerges when the conscious mind no longer wages war against the deeper forces of the psyche, but begins to listen to them with discernment. The goal is not to silence instinct, nor is it to obey every impulse. It is to rebuild a relationship with the quiet intelligence that exists beneath panic. Modern life makes this especially difficult. We live surrounded by endless warnings. News headlines compete for our attention by amplifying danger. Social media rewards outrage. Every notification invites us to prepare for the next crisis. Slowly, almost invisibly, we become accustomed to living as though the forest is filled with wolves waiting behind every tree. But the human soul was never meant to remain in a permanent state of alarm. Hypervigilance may keep us alert, yet it cannot teach us how to live. Only trust can do that, not blind trust, not naive optimism. But the deeper trust that grows from experience, the quiet confidence that even when uncertainty appears, we possess the inner resources to meet it. Perhaps this is the voice that Little Red Riding Hood had to discover for herself. Not the voice of certainty, not the voice of fear, but the voice that recognizes reality without surrendering to imagination. Marie-Louise von Franz often reminded us that fairy tales survive because they describe movements of the soul that never become outdated. The symbols remain alive because human beings continue to face the same inner conflicts, even when the outer world changes. That is why this story still speaks to us. We all enter forests we did not choose. We all hear sounds we cannot immediately explain. We all meet wolves, both real and imagined. The question is not whether the forest will become safe. It never will. The question is whether we can learn to walk through it without allowing fear to narrate every step. Perhaps wisdom is not found in escaping the forest. Perhaps it is found in discovering that the quiet voice of intuition was never lost. It was simply waiting to be heard again. And when that voice finally returns, the shadows do not disappear. They simply stop deciding the direction of your journey. Fairy tales have survived for centuries, not because they tell us about magical kingdoms, but because they tell us about ourselves. The Snow Queen reminds us that the greatest prisons are rarely built from stone or iron. More often, they are built from habits, fears, and beliefs we once created to protect ourselves. Over time, those protections can become so familiar that we mistake them for who we are. Perhaps that is the quiet tragedy of Kay's story. He did not lose his heart in a single moment. He slowly forgot what it felt like to live with it. And perhaps that is why Gerda's journey still speaks to us today. She reminds us that no amount of logic can replace genuine human connection, that no perfect system can substitute for love, and that no frozen landscape is beyond the reach of warmth. The path toward wholeness is not about abandoning reason. It is about allowing reason and feeling to walk together, each giving the other what it cannot create alone. So before you leave, take a moment to ask yourself, where in your life has the desire for certainty become stronger than the willingness to truly live? If this story helped you see the Snow Queen, or perhaps even yourself, from a new perspective, consider subscribing to Unconscious Wisdom. Every week, we explore the hidden psychological wisdom found in fairy tales, mythology, and the works of Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, uncovering timeless symbols that continue to shape our inner lives. If this episode resonated with you, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what part of this story reflected your own journey. Thank you for watching, and until our next journey into the unconscious, remember, sometimes the greatest transformation begins not when we learn something new, but when we allow the frozen parts of ourselves to feel again.